What if one stormy night changed everything for a man who only wanted peace? When the wind tore through his small cabin, it brought down an ancient oak tree and uncovered a secret buried beneath its roots. This is the story of Daniel Miller, a humble veteran, and his loyal dog Buddy, who discovered a hidden bunker that would uncover the truth, restore a family's honor, and heal a broken town. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this story of courage, faith, and second chances. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The afternoon air over rural Maine was thick with the scent of pine and the faint promise of rain. The clouds hung low and gray above the forested hills as Daniel Miller stepped out from the sawmill, wiping sweat and sawdust from his neck. He was 35 years old, broad-shouldered, but lean from years of hard labor. His brown jacket faded from sun and time. His face carried the quiet fatigue of a man who had seen war and returned to find that peace had its own battles. Once a soldier, Daniel now worked 10 hours a day, cutting timber and loading trucks, for a wage barely enough to survive. The war had left him with no medals worth money, only disciplined memories and debts that never seemed to shrink. He had borrowed to buy his truck, borrowed again when the engine failed, and borrowed a third time to pay hospital bills after a bad winter flu. The numbers followed him like shadows. Beside him trotted Buddy, a large German shepherd with black and gold fur and eyes the color of dark honey. Buddy was 6 years old, sturdy and alert, with a gait that carried the calm confidence of a well-trained companion. Daniel had adopted him from a shelter 2 years earlier, when the dog had been marked unfit for service after a leg injury. They had healed each other in silence. Buddy rarely barked, but his presence filled every quiet space in Daniel's life. The two were seldom apart. In the mornings, Buddy waited by the door while Daniel packed his lunch, and in the evenings, he followed him home through the same gravel road that cut between tall fir trees. The cabin they rented stood at the edge of a clearing not far from the sawmill. It was small and old, built from gray timber, with a tin roof that rattled when the wind came from the coast. The owner, an aging fisherman who lived down the road, charged little for it because the land was low and flooded every spring. For Daniel, it was enough. It gave him a bed, a roof, and silence. Silence was the one thing he still understood. That evening, the light dimmed faster than usual. The air grew heavy still and full of pressure. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the quiet warning of a storm moving in from the sea. He closed the workshop doors, pulled on his jacket, and called for Buddy. The dog looked up, ears pricked, and barked once as thunder rolled far away. They walked the narrow path back to the cabin as the first drops began to fall, darkening the dirt beneath their boots. Inside the cabin, the wind pressed against the windows, howling through cracks in the wood. Daniel set a small oil lamp on the table and listened to the rhythm of the rain. It came harder each minute until it was no longer rain, but sheets of water sweeping sideways across the porch. The trees bent and groaned. Loose shingles clattered somewhere above. Daniel stayed calm, checking the doors and corners, making sure nothing would give way. Buddy paced by the window, uneasy, his thick tail low, his instincts alert. Daniel spoke softly to him and sat back down by the table, trying to focus on the steady sound of rain instead of the thunder that shook the walls. Hours passed before the noise began to fade. The storm moved inland, leaving behind a wet hush. Daniel stood, stretched his sore shoulders, and took the lantern outside. The yard was a mess of broken branches and puddles reflecting the weak light. The ground smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Behind the cabin, the damage was worse. The great oak tree that had stood for decades was gone. Its wide trunk lay split and toppled roots torn out of the soil like ribs from the earth. Daniel walked closer, boots sinking into mud. The sight tightened his chest. The oak had been the heart of the small property shading the porch in summer and catching the snow on its branches in winter. Now it lay silent, a fallen giant. Beside him, Buddy sniffed the air and circled the exposed root's tail, moving slowly. Daniel ran a hand along the rough bark, feeling both sadness and resignation. Everything in his life seemed to break, sooner or later. The war had taught him to rebuild, even when there was nothing left worth rebuilding. As the lantern light flickered across the pit where the roots had been, Daniel noticed the earth had sunken deeper on one side, forming a narrow depression. Water was already pooling in it, dark and still. The soil there looked different, packed tighter, almost unnatural in its shape. He crouched and touched the edge of the pit. The ground was soft, fragile, and deeper than it should have been. It was the kind of thing that a man could lose a boot in, or worse. Buddy whined and backed away from the edge, ears twitching. Daniel looked at the dog, and then back at the hollow. The storm had torn more than just the tree. It had opened the ground itself, leaving behind something that felt wrong, like a scar, where the land had been wounded. He told himself it was just erosion, just the work of rain and roots, but the unease lingered. He straightened up and looked around the yard. The fences were down, the garden, flooded, the old oak gone. Everything else could be fixed with time and labor, but the pit stayed in his mind. He turned away at last and called Buddy. The dog came to heel immediately, brushing against his leg as they walked back to the cabin. Daniel glanced once more over his shoulder at the dark shape of the fallen tree and the fresh wound in the ground beside it. The night was quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt like peace. Back inside, Daniel dried Buddy with an old towel and sat by the small stove waiting for the chill to leave his bones. He thought about the next day, about work, about the tools he would need to cut the oak apart and fill the hole. It would take days he did not have, and strength he could barely spare, but he would do it. That was what life had taught him to do. Keep moving. Keep fixing what breaks. Outside, the wind had stopped completely. Only the faint creak of the trees and the slow dripping of water from the roof broke the stillness. Buddy lay at his feet, eyes half closed, but even in sleep, his ears twitched toward the sound of rain sliding off the porch. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams. His thoughts drifted to the debts waiting on his kitchen table and the long shifts ahead at the mill. He wondered if there would ever be a day without the weight of owing something to someone. He rubbed the back of his neck and tried to shake off the feeling that the storm had taken more than a tree from him. It had taken a small part of the stability he had built, piece by piece, since returning home. The land outside was broken, and in some way, so was he. Before heading to bed, he opened the door again and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, washed clean by the rain. The moon struggled through a gap in the clouds, casting a faint silver light over the yard. The fallen oak was a shadow against the ground, its roots reaching upward like the hands of something long buried. Daniel stood there for a long moment, the lantern light behind him, stretching his shadow across the wet boards. Buddy came to stand beside him, pressing his shoulder lightly against Daniel's leg. The man rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the warmth beneath the damp fur. He whispered that tomorrow they would start again. Then he closed the door, leaving the night and its quiet secrets outside. The morning after the storm was quiet and gray. Mist hung low over the trees, and the air smelled of wet bark and earth. The ground was soft under Daniel Miller's boots as he stepped outside the small cabin with a shovel in one hand. The storm had passed, but the damage was plain to see. Fallen branches littered the yard, and the great oak tree lay still across the ground. Daniel squinted at the mess and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the ache from yesterday's work at the sawmill. His jacket was already damp from the mist, but he did not mind. He had seen worse weather in worse places. He took a deep breath, steady and calm, ready to begin. Buddy ran ahead, nose to the ground, tail moving with quiet focus. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was always sharp in the mornings. His coat gleamed dark gold against the dull light, and his ears twitched with every sound from the forest. Daniel had learned to trust that sense more than his own. He grabbed an old axe and began cutting away the smaller branches to clear the path to the pit where the oak's roots had torn through the soil. Each swing of the axe echoed through the still air. As Daniel worked, sweat mixed with the chill, damp air. His hands were rough from years of labor, but his movements were steady, controlled the way soldiers learn to conserve strength. The war had taken his youth, but left him discipline. By noon, he had cleared most of the branches and paused to drink from a tin canteen. The pit yawned before him, wide and deep, the roots of the oak twisted like old bones. Water had pooled at the bottom, and the earth still shifted underfoot. Buddy circled the hole, sniffing the air, then stopped, suddenly, ears erect. He began to whine low, at first, then sharper, louder. Daniel looked up, surprised. The dog's paws scraped at the muddy edge, sending clumps of dirt tumbling down. Daniel frowned. There was something in the dog's posture, something urgent, not just curiosity. He called out, but Buddy ignored him and kept digging his strong legs, throwing mud aside with surprising force. Daniel set down the canteen and climbed down carefully into the pit, his boots sliding in the slick earth. He knelt beside Buddy, who had stopped barking and was now pawing at a corner hidden by the thick roots. The sound of metal scraping beneath the soil caught Daniel's attention. He reached forward, pushing the mud away until his fingers struck something hard and cold. He brushed off the remaining dirt and saw a faint glint of rusted steel. He sat back, breathing slowly, his mind turning. A piece of old farm equipment, perhaps, or part of the foundation from when the cabin was built decades ago. Still, the shape was too deliberate, too precise. It looked like a lid or a panel, its surface flat except for a round wheel handle in the center. Daniel stared at it, and then looked at Buddy. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on the metal object tail, low body tense. Curiosity replaced fatigue. Daniel climbed out of the pit and went to the small shed behind the cabin where he kept his tools. She'd smelled of oil and wood dust. Inside hung the few possessions he had accumulated since leaving the army. He took a crowbar, a small sledgehammer, and a can of lubricant. As he returned, Buddy stood waiting at the edge of the hole as if guarding it. Daniel smiled faintly, despite himself. He crouched beside the metal surface and sprayed the lubricant around the wheel handle. The smell was sharp in the damp air. He waited a few minutes, then wedged the crowbar under the edge of the handle and began to push. The metal groaned, but did not move. Rust clung to every seam, like a lock forged by time. Daniel tried again, muscles tightening across his shoulders. The wheel shifted a fraction of an inch with a screech that sent chills up his arms. He paused, wiping his forehead. His thoughts drifted to the men he had served with long ago, men who never made it home. They had fought to open doors, far heavier than this one, though the doors back then had led to danger, not mystery. He took another breath and pulled again, this time harder. Steady pressure, not brute force. The wheel turned slowly, half a rotation, then stopped. Daniel struck the handle lightly with the hammer, breaking the rust's grip, and twisted again. The sound that followed was a deep, hollow click, the sound of something unlocking after years of silence. The metal door shifted slightly, releasing a puff of cold, stale air. The smell of earth and old stone rose from below. Daniel hesitated, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He lifted the hatch with both hands, the weight fighting him until it finally gave way. Beneath it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The walls were concrete, slick with moisture and streaked with moss. Buddy barked, once the sound echoing down into the unseen space. Daniel shone his flashlight down the stairs and saw the faint outline of a small room at the bottom. His first thought was that it might be an old storm shelter. During the Cold War, people had built bunkers like this all across the countryside. Some were stocked with supplies, some with memories of fear. He climbed down slowly, one step at a time, his boots clanging softly against the concrete. The air grew colder, and the smell of dust and metal stronger. At the bottom, he swept the light across the room. It was small, no more than 10 feet wide with low walls and a flat ceiling. In one corner stood a simple wooden table covered with a thick layer of dust. On it rested a radio set, heavy and old, the kind used decades ago, its dials corroded with rust. Beside it lay an ammunition box, dark green with yellow letters faded to ghosts. Daniel reached out and brushed the dust from the radio. His fingers left streaks across the surface. He could almost imagine the hum of static that once filled this place, the low voice of someone long gone, waiting for a reply that never came. The box beside it was half open. Inside were a few empty casings and a single flashlight corroded but intact. The silence in the room was thick, only broken by the steady drip of water from the ceiling. He sat for a moment on the lowest step, letting the beam of his flashlight wander across the walls. There were no markings, no signs of anyone living here recently. The concrete was cracked and stained but strong. Whoever had built this bunker had done it well. Daniel's thoughts drifted. He wondered who they were, what they were hiding from, and why this place had been buried beneath the roots of an oak tree for so long. Buddy barked from above, impatient, perhaps uneasy. Daniel climbed back up, carefully brushing the dirt from his clothes. When he reached the surface, the light outside felt bright, almost blinding after the darkness below. Buddy wagged his tail, but his ears stayed alert, eyes fixed on the open hatch. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. The metal door gaped like a mouth in the ground, exhaling the chill of forgotten years. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. The discovery stirred something inside him, something that had been dormant since he left the army, a sense of purpose, the feeling that what he did mattered. He looked at the hatch again, wondering what stories lay hidden in that small underground room. For now, he covered the opening loosely with a tarp to keep out the rain. He would return later when the light was stronger and his mind clearer. The sky was beginning to clear. Rays of sunlight, pierced through the thinning clouds, casting long beams across the muddy yard. The oak tree lay still, its roots pointing toward the secret below. Daniel stood there beside Buddy, taking it all in. Life had not given him many surprises worth keeping, but this one felt different. He did not know what the bunker meant or why it existed, but he felt certain that finding it was not an accident. The storm had uncovered more than fallen wood and soil. It had uncovered a path he did not yet understand. As they walked back toward the cabin, Buddy glanced over his shoulder, once at the pit, then followed quietly at Daniel's side. The day was calm again, but beneath the calm, something unseen had awakened, waiting for the next step. The afternoon light was pale and thin over the clearing. The storm had left the air cool and quiet. The fallen oak still lay where it had fallen, roots lifted high like frozen waves. Daniel Miller stood beside the open hatch, with his sleeves rolled up and his face marked with dried mud. The chill wind brushed against his neck, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the metal lid and the thought of what lay beneath. The memory of the underground room had lingered all night. He could still smell the dust and metal, still feel the cold of the concrete on his skin. He had slept little. The discovery kept circling through his mind, each time sharper, clearer. Buddy paced nearby, tail, low nose, close to the ground. The German shepherd moved with quiet intent, sniffing at every patch of disturbed soil. His fur glistened faintly in the morning light, his breath steady. Daniel watched him for a moment and found comfort in the dog's focus. They had both lived by instinct through storms and silence. Now that same instinct might lead them further. Daniel climbed down into the bunker again, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The air was still damp. The old table and radio waited just as he had left them. On the ground, near the table, his light caught the corner of something half buried in dust. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. His fingers touched leather. He pulled out a small brown notebook, the edges stiff from age and moisture. The cover was plain, except for faint initials burned into the corner. The pages inside were yellowed but intact, each one filled with neat lines of faded handwriting and symbols scattered between paragraphs. Daniel turned a few pages. The handwriting was clear, but the content strange. It spoke of coordinates, numbers, and angles repeated again and again, as if mapping something hidden. There were mentions of 3 points labeled A, B, and C, and the words meeting line etched in red pencil. The writing ended abruptly near the middle of the book, as if someone had closed it mid-thought. He stood still, holding the notebook, the silence pressing around him. He was not a man of study, and the patterns made no sense to him, but they felt deliberate, purposeful. Buddy's claws scraped softly on the floor above. Daniel took that as a sign and climbed out again. Later that day, Daniel drove into the small town a few miles away. The truck rattled over uneven roads, the bed filled with old tools. The town of Alder Creek was quiet, a collection of weathered wooden buildings that leaned slightly from decades of coastal wind. The only sound came from the bell above the library door as Daniel pushed it open. Inside smelled of paper and old varnish. The light filtering through tall windows painted soft stripes across rows of shelves. A woman stood behind the front desk, sorting books into neat piles. She was in her early 30s, with chestnut hair pulled back loosely and glasses perched on her nose. Her skin was pale and freckled from the weak northern sun. Her posture was calm, but her movements, precise, deliberate. Daniel hesitated a moment, then spoke in a low voice, asking for help with an old notebook. The woman looked up, studying him. Her eyes were green, sharp, but kind. She introduced herself as Emily Carter, librarian of Alder Creek, for the past 8 years. She was known in town as a patient listener, someone who preferred quiet work to gossip. Her late father had been a school teacher, and she had inherited both his curiosity and his solitude. Daniel handed her the notebook. Emily turned it carefully, as if it might crumble. She adjusted her glasses and frowned slightly at the strange symbols. Her fingers traced the faded ink and the rows of numbers. She asked where he had found it. Daniel hesitated, then simply said, "Near his cabin after the storm." Her brow furrowed, but she nodded, choosing not to press further. They sat at a small table by the window. The afternoon light fell across the open pages. Emily pulled a scrap of paper and began copying the numbers, arranging them into columns. Daniel watched silently, his large hands resting on the table. He was aware of how out of place he seemed here among shelves and quiet air. The sawdust on his jacket smelled foreign in this world of ink and parchment. After a few minutes, Emily looked up. She said the numbers appeared to be coordinates, but incomplete missing direction markers. Still, the spacing suggested triangles, as if someone was trying to locate a central point. She drew 3 dots, labeled A, B, and C, then connected them with light pencil strokes, forming a rough triangle. Daniel leaned closer, studying the simple shape. It reminded him of map sketches used in training years ago. Emily explained that the ratios beside the numbers described distances, not exact locations. The angles formed something like a reference grid on a wall rather than a landscape. Daniel's thoughts turned immediately to the concrete walls of the bunker. He remembered faint marks there, shallow scratches he had taken for cracks. The idea that they could match this diagram sent a pulse of unease through him. He thanked her quietly and asked if she could copy the page. Emily smiled faintly, saying she would make a note of it, but asked him to be careful. The notebook was fragile and old, older than most Cold War relics she had cataloged before. Daniel nodded, took it back, and left. The road home was long and lined with dark pines. The sky had turned a dull silver. By the time he parked near the cabin, Buddy greeted him at the gate, tail wagging slowly. Daniel knelt beside him, running a hand along the dog's neck, and murmured that they had work to do. They went down into the bunker again before dusk. The air was colder now, the light from the flashlight trembling on the concrete. Daniel opened the notebook and held it beside the wall. He traced the triangle Emily had drawn and began comparing it with the marks. He found faint carvings on one side of the wall, 3 shallow indents that aligned roughly with the pattern. Each one was no bigger than a coin, but placed with precision. Buddy approached, sniffing the base of the wall, his ears tilted forward, his nose brushing against the lowest mark. Then he turned his head slightly and barked once sharp and certain. Daniel froze watching. The dog stepped back, then pawed lightly at the spot. The sound echoed in the small room. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He tapped the wall with the handle of the flashlight. The echo came back hollow, unlike the solid tone of the other sides. He exhaled slowly, realization settling in. The markings were not random. They were a map, and this spot was the center. Buddy stood still, eyes fixed on the same place, tail stiff. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's shoulder and whispered softly that they had found it, whatever it was. He stayed there a long moment, the beam of light steady on the concrete. The noise of the outside world was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of discovery. In that silence, Daniel felt something he had not known in years, a flicker of purpose beneath the weariness. He looked at Buddy, whose gaze never wavered, and felt that the dog understood. When they climbed out, the air was darker, the forest alive with distant sounds. The stars began to show between drifting clouds. Daniel stood by the pit, looking back at the open hatch. He did not know what the marks meant or who had made them, but he knew he would return. Tomorrow, he would bring stronger tools and light. He felt no fear, only the steady pull of curiosity and the sense that the land beneath him was beginning to speak. The sky that morning was dull and heavy with the scent of rain, though the storm had long passed. The wind moved softly through the pines, whispering against the cracked roof of the small cabin. Daniel Miller stood by the open hatch of the bunker, his brown jacket streaked with dust, and his hands wrapped tightly around the worn handle of a sledgehammer. His face was drawn, his eyes hollowed by another sleepless night. The memory of the strange carvings on the wall had stayed with him, pressing on his thoughts like a weight he could not shake. Buddy sat beside him, tail curled against the cold earth. The German shepherd was still watchful, muscles tense under his golden black fur. Every few moments, his ears would twitch, as if catching sounds too faint for Daniel to hear. The dog had sensed Daniel's unease since yesterday, staying close silent except for the occasional low whine. Daniel rested a hand on his back, the warmth of the dog's body grounding him before he began. He climbed down into the bunker, the beam of his flashlight trembling faintly on the concrete walls. The air was still damp, but less cold than before. Dust hung thick in the narrow space. The triangle marks on the wall glimmered faintly when the light passed over them. Daniel touched the center point where Buddy had scratched yesterday. The sound that came back when he tapped was hollow. He raised the sledgehammer, tightening his grip, and swung. The blow landed hard, sending a dull echo through the bunker. A crack appeared thin but clear. He struck again. The sound deepened, a faint groan like something behind the wall shifting. He paused, sweat beading along his temple. He had not done this kind of work since his days at the mill, and even then the machines had carried most of the burden. Now, it was just him and the hammer, and the steady rhythm of impact. Each swing brought flakes of concrete to the floor. Each pause filled with the sound of his breathing and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. After several minutes, the wall gave way. A chunk of concrete broke loose, revealing a cavity beyond. Daniel stepped back, catching his breath. He leaned closer, shining the flashlight through the opening. The beam caught the corner of something dark leather-bound and covered in dust. He widened the gap with the crowbar, the edges crumbling easily until the hole was large enough for him to reach through. His fingers brushed smooth leather and a cold metal clasp. He pulled slowly until the object came free. It was a large suitcase, brown, nearly black with age. Its surface was scuffed and cracked, but still solid. The weight of it surprised him, heavy dense as if filled with stone. He set it down carefully, wiping off the dust. The lock was rusted, but not sealed. He pried it open with the end of the crowbar. The hinges creaked loudly, breaking years of silence. Inside lay a stack of old documents, tied with faded string. The paper smelled of oil and decay. Beneath them was a small wooden box, and under that, a reel of tape neatly labeled in black ink. The name written there made him stop, Miguel Alvarez. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. The name meant nothing to him, yet it carried a strange familiarity, as if he had heard it somewhere long ago. He lifted the papers carefully, the edges fragile and soft with time. The first few sheets bore the heading Stock Certificates, followed by signatures and seals from banks and companies long defunct. The next bundle contained bank records written in both English and Spanish and dated more than 50 years ago. The numbers were large sums transferred between names, none of which Daniel recognized. He set the papers aside and opened the wooden box. Inside was a small stack of photographs, black and white curled at the corners. The first showed four men standing together in front of a building that looked like a workshop or warehouse. One of them, dark-haired and strong-faced, stood a little apart, his expression wary. The back of the photo bore the same name, Miguel Alvarez. Daniel studied the faces. The other three men looked American, dressed in old work clothes and jackets, one tall with a square jaw and deep lines in his face, another with thin spectacles and narrow eyes, the third smiling easily with a cigarette between his fingers. They looked like business partners, men who trusted each other or pretended to. The idea unsettled him. He turned the reel of tape in his hands. The label had faded, but the writing remained firm. A date was scrawled beneath October 1962. His thumb brushed the edge of the reel as if the faint touch could bring sound back to life. He wondered what voice had spoken into it and what story it carried. Buddy nudged his arm, breaking his thoughts. The dog's eyes were steady, calm, but alert. Daniel nodded. He felt a mixture of excitement and dread. His mind moved through possibilities. Money, hidden war secrets, lost property. But deeper than curiosity was a quiet empathy for the name written there. He thought of the man, Miguel Alvarez, imagined him as someone who had built something with his hands, who had worked hard and trusted the wrong people. Daniel had met enough men like that in his time, people who gave everything and were left with nothing but silence. He gathered the papers and placed them neatly back inside the case. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, but his thoughts were clear. He would need help to understand what this meant. Emily at the library might know how to read old records or trace the companies listed here. He trusted her sense of order, her quiet intelligence. She had looked at the notebook without judgment. Maybe she would do the same for this. Daniel locked the case and carried it up the narrow stairs. His shoulders ached under the weight. When he reached the surface, the light outside had turned golden, evening creeping through the trees. The air was crisp, full of pine and damp soil. He set the suitcase on the porch and sat beside it. Buddy lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, watching the forest with calm alertness. Daniel rubbed his hands together, the rough calluses catching against each other. He thought of Miguel Alvarez, whoever he had been, and what had driven him to hide something so carefully. He wondered if the man had lived in fear or hope or simply necessity. He thought of the years the suitcase had waited in darkness while generations passed above it. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt connected to something larger than his small life of debt and labor. The discovery felt like a thread, reaching through time, binding him to a stranger whose name he now carried in his thoughts. He did not yet know where it led, but he intended to follow. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the yard. The broken wall below lay hidden now under tarp and darkness, but its secret had been claimed. Daniel leaned back against the porch post, listening to the wind and the quiet breathing of his dog. He felt tired, but alive, in a way that work had never given him. He whispered to Buddy that tomorrow they would return to town. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching at the familiar tone, then settled again. Content, Daniel looked out over the fallen oak and the clearing beyond. The storm had taken one thing, but given another. In the fading light, the suitcase glowed faintly from the reflection of the lantern beside it. It was heavy, not only with paper and metal, but with memory. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The morning sky hung gray above Alder Creek, the light thin and filtered through drifting clouds. The forest beyond Daniel's cabin stood silent, soaked in the chill of early day. A faint mist coiled through the air, wrapping around the edges of the fallen oak and the open pit beside it. Daniel Miller sat on the porch, a cup of cold coffee resting between his hands, and the heavy suitcase open at his feet. The tape reel inside gleamed faintly beneath the pale light. Buddy the German shepherd lay close to his boots, head raised, ears twitching at every sound. The dog's dark eyes followed Daniel's every motion, as though sensing that something heavy waited to be uncovered. Daniel had spent most of the night turning the tape in his hands, unable to bring himself to play it. The name written on its side, Miguel Alvarez, still echoed in his mind. He had imagined the man's face again and again from the old photograph, the wary eyes and weathered skin of a working man who carried the quiet dignity of someone who built his life from nothing. Daniel had seen men like that, overseas. Men who worked through exhaustion, held by faith and duty until the world betrayed them. He had no reason to care for a stranger, long dead. Yet the weight of the man's story pressed on him. When dawn came, Daniel made up his mind. He needed a way to hear what the tape contained. There was only one person in town who might have the kind of machine old enough to play it. Emily Carter at the library. The thought gave him some comfort. Her steady, calm presence had a way of quieting the noise inside him. He packed the tape carefully inside a box, wrapped it in an old towel, and drove toward Alder Creek with Buddy in the passenger seat. The town was waking slowly as he arrived. The hardware store owner swept the porch, and the faint smell of bread drifted from the bakery window. The library stood near the center of the street, small and square, its brick walls warmed by years of sun. Daniel parked the truck and stepped out. Buddy stayed close, his paws patting softly against the pavement. Inside the library, the air was still and faintly sweet from old paper. Emily stood near the back, organizing a shelf. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her cardigan hung open over a plain white blouse. The early light caught the side of her face, softening her freckles. When she turned and saw him, her expression shifted quickly, from surprise to concern. She asked if something was wrong. Daniel only said he had found something more. They moved to the reading table near the window. Daniel placed the box on the wood surface and opened it, revealing the reel. Emily leaned closer, curiosity lighting her face. She handled it with careful fingers, the way she treated old books and fragile bindings. She said the library's basement held a donated reel to Reel Player from the local historical society. She had never used it, but it might still work. They carried the box downstairs. The basement smelled of dust and oil, the walls lined with old filing cabinets and forgotten furniture. Emily found the machine beneath a canvas cover and set it on a metal table. She tested the power cord, and to their surprise, the old lamp beside it flickered to life. Daniel stood beside her, his hands tightening on the edge of the table as she threaded the tape through the spools. The sound that came first was static, a faint hiss like distant wind. Then a voice emerged, cracked, thin-aged by time, but unmistakably human. "My name is Miguel Alvarez," the voice said, slow and deliberate. Each word carried strain, as if spoken from the edge of exhaustion. "If you are hearing this, I am already gone. I leave this record for whoever may one day find the truth." Daniel felt the air leave his chest. Emily looked at him, eyes wide but silent. The voice continued steady, though trembling with pain. "I came to this land in 1949 with nothing but my hands. I built homes, worked the fields, and trusted men who called me brother. They said we would share the land, profits equal as friends. I believed them because I wanted to belong." A pause, followed then a deep breath. The sound of paper rustling filtered through the speaker. "They took everything." The voice cracked on the word, everything. "My partners, one by one, turned against me. William Croft led them. He said, an immigrant could not own land in this county. They forged my name on the deeds, took my share of the company, and buried the rest beneath this ground." Daniel felt a cold weight sink into his stomach. He recognized the name Croft from the old stock papers in the suitcase. Emily sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the turning reels. Miguel's voice resumed softer now, as if fading with each word. "If anyone hears this, tell my family I did not run. I fought until they made me disappear. One day justice will come through those who listen." The tape ended in a soft click. The silence that followed was heavy. Emily leaned forward and pressed the stop button. Her fingers lingered on the metal for a moment before she looked up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, this sounds like a confession, or a warning, maybe both. Do you know who William Croft is?" Daniel nodded slowly. His voice was low, rough with disbelief. "I know the name Croft. There is a man in town named Julian Cross. He changed the spelling years ago. He runs a real estate company, big one out of Portland. He's been buying land all over this county, trying to turn it into some luxury housing thing. I heard about him at the mill. He made an offer for the land I rent. He said it was worthless for farming, but perfect for development." Emily frowned, realizing the connection. Julian Cross was the descendant, the inheritor of stolen ground. Her eyes darkened with thought. Her father had once told her how wealth in small towns often began with buried stories, but hearing it alive in the voice of a betrayed man felt different. Daniel stood silent a long time. His breath came slow and uneven. He thought of Miguel Alvarez, dying alone after losing everything. Thought of the 3 men who had built their lives on that theft. He had spent years blaming himself for failures, debts, mistakes that seemed unending. But now, the injustice that ran beneath this land felt far larger than his own troubles. Buddy moved closer, pressing his head against Daniel's knee. The man reached down, absently, running his rough hand through the dog's thick fur. The simple motion steadied him. He said quietly, more to himself than to Emily, "He lost everything for this land, and now the same family wants to bury it under concrete." Emily looked at him, her expression full of quiet determination. "You cannot face this alone," she said firmly. "This is history and proof. You have something that people need to hear." Daniel nodded, but his jaw tightened. He was not used to fighting with words or laws. His battles had always been physical survival, but something deeper stirred inside him. A sense of duty born from another man's pain. He looked down at Buddy, who met his gaze with calm understanding. The dog's steady presence reminded him that even in loss, loyalty could endure. They left the basement, carrying the tape carefully wrapped once more in the towel. The morning had brightened slightly outside, though the clouds still hung low. Daniel stepped into the wind, feeling its cool rush across his face. It carried the scent of pine and distant sea. He no longer felt like a man merely surviving. He felt like the keeper of a truth that demanded to be seen. The night was cold and restless. The air carried the scent of salt from the distant sea, and the faint echo of thunder rolling far beyond the hills. Inside the small cabin, Daniel Miller sat at the wooden table, the heavy suitcase beside him, and the old shotgun laid across his knees. The lantern light flickered on his face, drawing hard shadows across the lines of fatigue and resolve. Buddy the German Shepherd lay near the door, silent but alert, his golden black fur gleaming faintly in the dim light. Every few moments, the dog lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound of the wind outside Daniel had spent the last 2 hours preparing. The tape, the papers, and the notebook were all sealed back inside the suitcase and hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the pantry. He had spoken earlier that evening with Sheriff Ben Carter, an old friend from the service. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with short gray hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen too much, but still believed in doing what was right. They had met years ago in uniform in a desert that neither of them spoke about anymore. Now Carter worked the small coastal district around Alder Creek, known for quiet fishing disputes and the occasional theft. Never for anything like this, Daniel had called him, using the old payphone at the edge of the road, explaining in clipped, careful sentences that trouble was coming. He told Carter to bring 2 deputies to the lane leading to his cabin and to wait there until his call came. He made it clear there might be danger. The sheriff had not asked for details, only said, in his low, steady voice, that he would be there. The night deepened. Outside, the wind grew stronger, pushing against the loose shutters. Daniel could feel the weight of what was coming pressing in from the dark. The truth he had uncovered, the betrayal of Miguel Alvarez, and the greed of Julian Cross had reached its inevitable end. There was no running from it now. He looked down at Buddy, who was watching him closely, and said quietly, "Stay close, boy." Headlights appeared in the distance, long before he heard the engines. The narrow dirt road shimmered faintly with the approach of vehicles. Daniel stood slowly, his heartbeat steady. He moved to the window and saw them 3 cars. The first, a black sedan, sleek and polished, even in the dim light. He could almost sense the arrogance behind the wheel. Julian Cross had arrived. Julian stepped out first, tall and impeccably dressed in a dark coat and polished shoes, his expression calm but sharp. His hair was neatly combed back, streaked with silver, and his eyes were the pale color of ice. 2 men followed him, broad-shouldered, rougher-looking one with a shaved head and a jagged scar across his cheek, the other heavier set with a thick beard and cold eyes. They moved with the precision of men used to being told what to do. Julian approached the porch, his voice smooth and casual, but carrying the weight of command. "Daniel Corrigan," he said as he stopped at the steps. Though the name was wrong, the intention was not. "I think you have something that belongs to me." Daniel's hands tightened on the shotgun. He kept his tone even. "What you think you own was never yours, Julian." The older man smiled faintly. "That depends on who writes the history, doesn't it? My family built this land, and if a few papers got misplaced over the years, well, that is hardly my fault. I am simply reclaiming what was lost." He gestured for his men to move. The 2 bodyguards advanced, stepping onto the porch. Their boots creaked against the old boards. Buddy rose to his feet, growling low and deep, his ears flat against his head. Daniel raised one hand. "Stay back," he said quietly, but his voice carried the authority of a man who had once given orders in a place where hesitation meant death. Julian stopped at the door a few feet away. He studied Daniel with cool disdain. "There is no need for dramatics," he said. "Give me the case and the tape, and you can walk away. I can even make your debts disappear." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You cannot buy what is not for sale." He stepped back into the house, opening the door wide. "Come on," then he said, his tone calm but final. "You want what is in there, you will have to take it yourself." Julian hesitated, then nodded to his men. "Move," he said curtly. The two thugs followed Daniel through the doorway, guns drawn. Julian came behind them, still confident, certain of control. The air inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and oil, the shadows long across the walls. Daniel led them to the hatch of the bunker and gestured downward. "It's all below." The descent into the darkness took only seconds. The beam of a flashlight cut through the air, revealing the concrete walls and the open space of the old shelter. Julian stepped down, last glancing around with open curiosity. He saw nothing but old dust and broken shelves. He turned back to Daniel, his patience thinning. "Well," Daniel's voice was calm, steady behind them. "It is there by the west wall." He raised the shotgun suddenly and fired not at them, but at the far side of the room. The blast of birdshot tore into the dirt wall, sending up a roar of sound and a wave of choking dust. The lights vanished into haze. The confined space filled instantly with the acrid smell of smoke and powder. The men shouted, one swearing loudly, as they stumbled back. Julian coughed and tried to wave away the cloud, but it thickened faster than he could react. Buddy launched forward out of the haze, his movement a blur. The dog struck the heavier guard, first hitting his leg with full force, knocking him off balance. The man crashed to the floor, yelling as Buddy's jaws locked onto his sleeve, dragging him away from the stairs. Daniel moved fast, using the confusion. He kicked the weapon from the other man's hand and shouted, "Buddy, go!" The dog released and turned to face the second guard, snarling his body low and ready. Julian stumbled back against the wall, his confidence gone, replaced by panic. Outside in the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. Sheriff Carter was coming. Daniel's call had reached him exactly on time. The sound grew louder, echoing through the forest. Julian froze, his pale eyes darting toward the hatch. He looked back at Daniel, fury replacing fear. "You think this ends tonight? You have no idea who I am." Daniel leveled the shotgun, his voice cold. "You are a man who took what was never his and buried the truth in the ground. That is all you will ever be." The door above burst open. The echo of boots and voices filled the bunker. Sheriff Carter appeared at the top flashlight, cutting through the dust hands where I can see them. He barked. His deputies followed, weapons drawn. Within moments, the scene shifted from chaos to control. The two bodyguards were disarmed. Julian stood motionless, his expression tight with disbelief as Carter's men cuffed him. Daniel lowered the shotgun slowly, his chest rising and falling with the heavy rhythm of spent adrenaline. Buddy stood beside him, panting, eyes bright but calm. The sheriff descended the steps, glancing briefly at the wrecked wall and the fallen men before looking at Daniel. "You all right, Art?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. His voice came rough but certain. "It is over." Ben Carter's eyes moved to the old suitcase, now half visible beneath a fallen tarp. He gave a short nod. "We will take that as evidence. The tape, too." He turned to his men. "Gather everything and mark this as a secured site." As they led Julian and his men away, the wail of sirens faded into the night, replaced by the soft hum of the forest. Daniel stood at the edge of the open hatch, Buddy at his side. The lantern light flickered over the concrete floor and the cracked wall. He felt the first stir of calm since the day he had found the pit in his yard. The fight was over, and the truth at last belonged to the light. The morning came with soft gray clouds drifting over Alder Creek. The air carried the smell of damp pine and wet soil, as if the earth itself had been washed clean by the storm. The cabin stood quiet, the sound of the forest returning like a slow heartbeat. Daniel Miller sat on the porch steps, his brown jacket folded beside him, and Buddy lying close by, head resting on his paws. The German shepherd's fur shimmered faintly in the dim light, his ears twitching at every sound. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a strange peace that he had not known since returning from the war. He watched the trees swaying gently in the breeze, his thoughts heavy but calm. The events of the past night still clung to him. The smoke, the shouting, the weight of the shotgun in his hands. He had spent years running from battles, and yet somehow found himself in another one. But this time, the fight had not been for survival. It had been for truth, for a man, long dead, who had trusted too much and lost everything. The sound of a car approaching pulled him from his thoughts. A small silver sedan stopped by the fence. Emily Carter stepped out, her usual calm presence wrapped in a light blue coat. She carried a folder pressed against her chest, her auburn hair tied back loosely. Behind her, another car followed, black and newer. A woman stepped out from the passenger seat, and for a moment, Daniel thought he was seeing a ghost. She was in her late 20s, with long, dark hair that shimmered under the pale light. Her skin was olive-toned, her posture graceful but steady. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, but her presence carried quiet strength. Her eyes, deep brown and thoughtful, met Daniel's with a blend of curiosity and sorrow. Emily walked beside her, introducing softly, "Daniel, this is Sophia Alvarez, Miguel's granddaughter." Daniel stood slowly, nodding in silent respect. Sophia extended her hand, her fingers slender but firm. Her voice was low, with a gentle Spanish accent. "Mr. Miller, I wanted to thank you for what you did for my grandfather's name." Daniel shook his head quietly. "It is not me. You should thank Miss Alvarez. It was your grandfather who left the truth behind. I just happened to find it." She smiled faintly, and there was sadness in that smile. "For years," she said softly, "my family thought he had run away. There were stories, whispers, that he took money and disappeared. It broke my mother's heart. She died, never knowing the truth." Emily placed a comforting hand on Sophia's arm and led them toward the porch. Inside, the cabin papers and evidence from the investigation lay stacked neatly across the table. Sheriff Carter had delivered them earlier that morning. Along with the news, Julian Cross had been officially charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted bribery. The development company was being dissolved under court order. Daniel had listened quietly while Carter spoke, nodding only once at the end. Sophia opened her bag and took out a thin folder. She explained that her family attorney had worked through the night-gathering proof of ownership, the old stock certificates, the bank records, the letters in Miguel's handwriting, all were authenticated. She turned the folder toward Daniel. Inside were two documents. One confirmed the restoration of property rights to the Alvarez family. The other was a transfer release form, releasing Daniel Miller and Emily Carter from all claim and responsibility. Emily read the papers carefully, her green eyes scanning every word. She adjusted her glasses and then looked at Daniel, who sat silent, his calloused hands folded on his knees. She said softly, It means we give back everything we found. It belongs to them now. Daniel nodded slowly. His voice was steady, but quiet. That is how it should be. He took the pen she handed him and signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes. Emily did the same beside him. Sophia watched them, her eyes glistening, not from greed, but gratitude. She said when the papers were done, "My grandfather believed good men still existed. He would have been proud to meet you both." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His tail thumped softly against the floor. Sophia smiled at him, bending slightly to offer her hand. The dog sniffed her palm and leaned gently into her touch. Daniel watched quietly, something warm flickering behind his tired eyes. Outside, the clouds began to break, the first streaks of sunlight touching the trees. The forest that once held secrets now seemed brighter alive again. Sophia stood near the door, looking out for a long moment. She said quietly, "The land will stay as it is. My family decided not to sell it or build on it. We will keep the woods and the old fields as they were. My grandfather would have wanted that." Emily smiled gently. "That sounds right. Some stories should end in peace, not profit." Daniel said nothing, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. They stepped outside together. The air was cool and bright, the breeze carrying the scent of cedar. Sophia turned to him one last time and said softly, "Mr. Miller, I hope you find peace too. You brought my family back, our name, our home." Daniel met her gaze. "There is peace enough in that, Miss Alvarez. Take good care of it." Sophia nodded, then walked toward the car. Emily lingered a moment beside him, watching as the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road. She looked at Daniel, her voice soft but firm. "What will you do now?" He glanced toward the horizon where the trees met the gray sky. "I think I will rebuild the cabin. Maybe work at the mill for a while." He paused, then smiled faintly. "Maybe Buddy and I will finally learn to rest." Emily's eyes softened. "You deserve that." She said goodbye quietly, her figure fading down the path toward town. Daniel stood for a moment longer, the forest whispering around him. Buddy came to sit beside him, pressing his head against his leg. Daniel knelt, placing a rough hand on the dog's neck, and said, "It is done, Buddy. We did what we were meant to." The sun rose higher, spreading warmth through the clearing. The broken ground near the fallen oak had been covered now with fresh soil. The scars of the storm and of the past began to fade. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time, Daniel felt that the land had forgiven them both. The morning sun rose slow and golden over Alder Creek, the light soft as it spilled through the tall pines. The forest glistened with dew, the air cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of cedar and wildflowers. A new sign stood near the entrance of the old property, carved in dark wood, with simple letters reading Alvarez Grove. The land once hidden and burdened by greed had found a new name and a new purpose. Daniel Miller walked along the narrow trail that wound through the trees. His brown jacket was worn at the edges. His jeans faded from years of work, but there was a quiet strength in his step. The lines on his face were softer now, and his eyes, though still shadowed by memory, held something close to peace. Beside him, Buddy the German Shepherd trotted with easy grace, his fur shining golden under the sunlight. The dog's tail moved lazily, as if in rhythm with the morning breeze. It had been 6 months since the court restored the Alvarez land to its rightful heirs. The family had chosen not to sell. Instead, they donated part of it to the town to preserve the woods and create a sanctuary for veterans and working dogs. a place of quiet therapy and renewal for those who carried battles within themselves. The county named Daniel its caretaker and volunteer trainer for the Canine Rehabilitation Program. It was work that felt like breathing to him, honest and grounded in purpose. He reached the open clearing where the old cabin once stood. The burned soil had been replaced by fresh grass, and a small wooden structure now stood there, built by volunteers and local carpenters. Its porch faced east, catching the morning light. Daniel paused, looking out over the land, his chest filled with quiet gratitude. He could still remember the chaos that had brought him here, the storm, the discovery, the danger. But now, the world was still. Buddy barked once, softly, his ears turning toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Emily Carter appeared from the trail carrying a basket in her arms. She wore a light gray sweater and jeans, her hair loose today, catching the light in warm auburn strands. Her calm steps and faint smile carried the same quiet confidence that had steadied Daniel through all the months of rebuilding mourning. She said, her voice gentle but bright. She set the basket down on the porch, revealing sandwiches, coffee, and a folded stack of papers. "You forgot your lunch again. And the reports for the Veterans Committee?" He smiled faintly. "I knew you would remember." She gave him a look that was half amusement, half exasperation. "You rely too much on that." They sat together on the porch. Buddy stretched out between them, his head resting on Daniel's boot. The forest hummed with life birds, darting between branches, and the wind whispering through the leaves. For a long while neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of understanding, shared through the quiet. Emily glanced at the open field, beyond where a group of young veterans were walking the trail, accompanied by their dogs. Some were training others, simply walking, slowly, breathing in the peace of the forest. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the trees. Daniel watched them, his face thoughtful. "These men and women know what it means to lose themselves out there," he said softly. "Maybe the forest can help them find a little of it back." Emily nodded, her eyes warm. "It already is," she said. "This place is more than land now. It is healing." Buddy's ears perked as one of the younger dogs barked excitedly. Daniel chuckled. "He has taken to the new recruits better than I expected." Buddy turned his head toward him as if understanding, and wagged his tail lazily. Emily smiled. "He has become the favorite." She leaned down to scratch the dog's ear and added softly, "You both have." Daniel looked at her for a moment, the sunlight catching her face. He thought of all that had changed since the storm, the burden of debt, the silence of his nights, the anger that once lingered like smoke. All of it had faded, replaced by something steady and quiet. He said, "Emily, you could have left after everything, but you stayed." She met his gaze. "Because you did," she said simply. They shared a small smile, and the wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of pine needles. The air felt alive again. Around them, Alvarez Grove had become a living memorial. The cabins served as shelters for veterans in transition, the trails as paths for reflection. A small plaque by the entrance bore the names of Miguel Alvarez and Daniel Miller. Side by side, a reminder that one man's silence and another's persistence had rebuilt something larger than themselves. By noon, Daniel led a small group through the grove, teaching them the basics of canine handling. Most of the dogs were rescues, strong-spirited but untrained. He spoke with quiet patience, his voice steady and warm. Buddy demonstrated every command with calm precision. The men and women followed his lead, their movements slow, but sure. After the lesson, Daniel watched them from a distance, pride softening his features. Emily joined him, her notebook tucked under her arm. "You have a gift with them," she said. He shrugged. "It is not a gift. It is just listening. Dogs understand what words cannot." She smiled. "I think that is what makes it a gift." The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, painting everything gold. The sound of the creek murmured nearby. Buddy stood at the water's edge, lapping quietly before looking back, tail swaying. Daniel felt a deep sense of belonging, something he had thought lost forever. He turned to Emily and said softly, "I used to think peace was something you had to earn. Now I think it is something you have to allow." She nodded, her eyes shining under the fading light. "Maybe both," she said. As the day faded into dusk, Daniel and Buddy walked along the trail once more. The air had cooled, the scent of earth and pine deepened. The sign of Alvarez Grove stood tall at the entrance, bathed in the last light of day. Daniel paused for a moment, his hand resting on Buddy's back. The dog looked up at him, eyes steady. Loyal as always, Daniel smiled. "Come on, Buddy. Time to go home." The two walked back toward the cabin, their figures framed by the golden horizon. The forest whispered softly around them, and for the first time in a long life, marked by war and loss, Daniel Miller knew he was exactly where he belonged. And so, as the golden light faded behind the pines, Daniel stood with Buddy by his side, watching the last glow settle over Alvarez Grove. The air felt still, yet full of life, each breath carrying the scent of hope reborn around them. A land once buried in greed had become a place of giving. A man once lost in silence had found his voice through love and service. This story was not only about Daniel or Buddy, or even the Alvarez family. It was about how redemption can rise from the ashes when people choose kindness over bitterness. It was about how faith can rebuild what storms destroy, and how even one act of courage can heal an entire community. Every tree standing in Alvarez Grove was a symbol of second chances. Every rescued dog and every soldier who walked those trails carried a reminder that grace does not forget anyone. Sometimes God works quietly through broken men and faithful animals, leading them to rebuild what was meant to last forever. And perhaps that is the miracle of life itself, that no matter how dark the storm or how heavy the burden, there will always be a new dawn, waiting for those who still believe. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from and what blessings you are grateful for. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith and redemption. May God bless you, your home, and all those you love with peace, strength, and light.